A child returned from school with dry eyes, but a completely broken heart. She didn't cry, didn't speak, just walked in silence, like someone carrying something far too heavy for such a small age. And when she finally opened her mouth, the phrase she said made her father drop everything in his hands and run to the phone with trembling fingers. On a gray April morning that clung to the hills of Kilkerran like wet wool, 7-year-old Thea Jovanovic pushed through the front door with her face pale as morning mist and her school blouse twisted as though she'd wrestled with the wind itself. The Jovanovic house still smelled of fresh paint and damp timber, newly built in a tucked-away lane where no one passed without noticing. A deliberate choice by the council to place the foreign families where they wouldn't disturb the established rhythm of village life. Her father, Dusan, sat hunched at the kitchen table like a man carrying invisible weights, gas bills scattered before him like fallen leaves. His weathered hands, stained permanently with paint and plaster dust from his maintenance work, traced the numbers again and again, calculating how many euros they could spare this month. The morning light filtering through their small windows caught the worry lines etched deep around his gray eyes, lines that had appeared the day they'd fled Bosnia, and deepened with each rejection letter, each suspicious glance, each reminder that they were guests in a country that barely tolerated their presence. He barely lifted his eyes when he heard the door slam shut with unusual force. Only when the little girl stopped dead center in the sitting room, not saying good morning as she always did, not removing her mud-caked shoes despite Milena's constant reminders, did he look up properly. What he saw made his blood run cold as the Shannon in winter. She clutched her school bag against her chest like a shield, her small knuckles white with the effort. The bag itself was second-hand, bought from a charity shop in Galway when they'd first arrived. Navy blue with a patch sewn over a torn corner, but clean and cared for with the desperate pride of people who own so little. Those dark eyes, usually bright as summer blackberries, were empty now, hollow as tide pools after the sea has retreated, staring at something only she could see. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Dusan felt his chest tighten with the familiar panic that came whenever his daughter looked like this. Lost, unreachable, as though part of her had simply walked away and left her body behind. He'd seen that look before during their final weeks in Sarajevo, when the sounds of distant explosions had made her stop speaking for days at a time. "Thea," he said softly, using the gentle tone he reserved for wounded birds and frightened children. "What's happened, my little star?" And then she spoke, without hesitation, without raising her voice, without the tremor that should have been there. She simply let the words fall like stones into still water, each syllable carrying the weight of something unspeakable. The bus driver did it again. The spoon in Dusan's hand hit the floor with a crack that seemed to echo through every corner of their small home, bouncing twice before settling against the leg of his chair. His wife Milena came running from the utility room at the sound, her hands still damp from the washing, soap suds clinging to her wrists. She moved with the quick, efficient grace of a woman who'd learned to respond to crisis, first in war-torn Bosnia, then in refugee camps, now in this Irish village where danger wore different faces but felt just as real. The silence that settled over them was the kind you feel in your spine, the sort that comes before storms no one wants to weather. It filled the small room like fog, thick and suffocating, carrying with it the weight of unspoken fears and the bitter taste of recognition. They both knew, in that terrible instant, that the fragile peace they'd built in Kilkerran was about to shatter. Dusan tried to ask what exactly had happened, his voice catching in his throat like a fishhook. The words came out in broken English mixed with fragments of Bosnian, the way they always did when emotion overwhelmed his careful pronunciation. But Thea only lowered her head, her dark hair falling like a curtain across her face, shutting them out as effectively as a locked door. Milena dropped to her knees before her daughter, ignoring the dampness seeping through her jeans from the kitchen floor. She touched that small, cold cheek with trembling fingers, feeling the fever that wasn't really fever, the heat that comes from shame and fear burning just beneath the skin. "What did he do, love?" she whispered in Irish-accented English, though her heart was beating in the Bosnian of her childhood, the language of lullabies and prayers and desperate promises made in the dark. The child shivered, not from cold, but from something far deeper. Her whole body seemed to fold in on itself, making her appear even smaller than her 7 years. Milena could feel the tremor running through her daughter's frame, could see the way Thea's eyes darted toward the window as though expecting to see someone watching, waiting. Milena looked up at her husband, seeing the hesitation in his glass-gray eyes, the way he glanced toward the windows as if the neighbors might already be listening through the thin walls of their new-built house. She recognized that look, the same expression he'd worn when they'd first arrived at Dublin Airport, clutching their asylum papers and trying to make themselves invisible. "Let's think carefully before we ring the guards," he said, his accent thick with worry and something else, fear, perhaps, of losing what little they'd built in this place that barely accepted them. The weight of his words settled between them like lead. They both knew what he meant. They were foreigners here, tolerated but not welcomed, watched but not protected. One wrong move, one complaint too many, and they could find themselves back where they'd started, homeless, stateless, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a child who'd already seen too much. But Milena was already reaching for the phone, her fingers moving with the certainty of a mother whose child has been wounded. The familiar weight of the handset felt solid in her palm as she dialed 112, each number pressed with deliberate force. The voice of the operator seemed as distant as the Atlantic waves that crashed against the Galway coast, while she spoke with a firmness that surprised even herself. "It's about the school bus driver and my daughter." In that moment, none of them knew that this single phone call would split their small village down the middle, dividing those who preferred to protect reputations from those who chose to hear the truth. The line crackled with static, but Milena's words were crystal clear, carrying across the wire like a warning bell that could never be unrung. Outside, the Irish sky grew darker, heavy with rain that hadn't yet decided to fall. And in the Jovanovic sitting room, a family stood at the edge of something that would change everything, though they couldn't yet see how deep the waters ran, or how many others had already drowned in silence. Capítulo 2, O Homem do Volante. His name was Odrin Killeen, 63 years old, retired from the Coast Guard, and for 20 years the school bus driver for the region surrounding Kilcarran. To most in the village, he was what they called a pillar of the community, the sort of man who greeted the elderly residents by their first names, bought newspapers for the parish every Sunday after Mass, and handed out sweets to children on Halloween night with the broad smile of a beloved grandfather. His cottage sat on the main road with roses climbing the gray stone walls and a green door that was always freshly painted each spring. The garden was his pride. Neat rows of vegetables, prize-winning dahlias, and a small greenhouse where he grew tomatoes that won ribbons at the county fair. Neighbors would stop to chat over the low stone wall, and he'd offer them cuttings from his prized flowers or advice about dealing with slugs and greenfly. To them, he was Odrin, who helped Mrs. Flanagan with her shopping when her arthritis flared, who cleared snow from the church steps without being asked, who never missed a funeral or failed to send condolences. But to Thea Jovanovic, he was something else entirely, something that no one else saw or pretended not to see. That very evening, as rain drummed against their new windows with the persistence of small stones, Dushan confronted his wife across their small kitchen table. The fluorescent light above cast harsh shadows on both their faces, making them look older, more worn than their years warranted. "Do you really want to risk everything we've built here? The school, our jobs, our life?" His voice carried the weight of a man who'd already lost one country and couldn't bear to lose another home. The bills lay forgotten between them: electricity, gas, water, council tax, each one a reminder of how precarious their position really was. Somewhere in the house, Thea was in her room and they could hear the soft scratch of colored pencils on paper, always drawing now, never playing with the few toys they'd managed to buy her. Her drawings had changed in recent weeks. Gone were the bright houses with smiling stick figures. Now she drew empty roads, lone figures standing by trees, and strange, dark shapes that neither parent could identify, but that made their stomachs clench with unnameable dread. Milena couldn't ignore the way her daughter flinched at the sound of the bus engine each morning, how she'd started wetting her bed again after months of being dry. The child who once chattered about her day in a mixture of English and Bosnian now came home silent, her uniform somehow always disheveled, her homework often incomplete despite being a bright student. "She won't tell me exactly what happened," Milena said, her words steady but her hands shaking as she poured tea that had gone cold hours ago. "But she said he did it again, and that's enough for me." Dushan ran his hands through his thinning hair, a gesture Milena had learned to recognize as his way of buying time when faced with impossible choices. "Milena, think about this. We're immigrants here, barely tolerated as it is. If we make accusations against someone like Killeen, a man who's lived here his whole life, who everyone respects, what do you think will happen to us?" To Thea, The question hung in the air between them like smoke. They both knew the answer. They'd seen it happen to other immigrant families. Whispered conversations that stopped when they entered a room. Job applications that were suddenly no longer available. Children who found themselves friendless and isolated. The unspoken message was always clear. Know your place. Keep your head down. Be grateful for what you're given. Sleep wouldn't come that night. Milena lay staring at the ceiling, listening to her husband's restless turning and the soft whimpers from Thea's room that came every hour or so. Little sounds of distress that her daughter made in sleep, as though even her dreams weren't safe anymore. The digital clock by their bed seemed to mock her with its relentless progression. 11:47, 12:23, 1:15, 2:04. Each glowing number brought her closer to morning, to another day of sending her child into a situation she couldn't protect her from. By dawn, gray light filtering through their thin curtains, she'd made her decision. She would walk her daughter to the bus stop, not to send her off, but to watch. To see with her own eyes what everyone else seemed determined to miss. The morning air was sharp with the promise of rain, carrying the scent of wet earth and growing things. Milena dressed carefully in her best jeans and a clean jumper, wanting to look respectable, belonging. She helped Thea with her uniform, the navy pinafore, white blouse and small tie that marked her as a student at St. Brigid's Primary. The child submitted to her mother's attentions with unusual stillness, like a doll being dressed. They walked the familiar route to the bus stop, past Mrs. Connolly's cottage with its perfectly trimmed hedge, past the post box that still bore scratches from the last time someone had tried to vandalize it with anti-immigrant graffiti, past the small shrine to the Virgin Mary where fresh flowers appeared each week despite the fact that no one ever saw who placed them there. At the stop, Milena kissed her daughter goodbye as always, but instead of returning home, she slipped behind the ancient oak tree that stood across the narrow road. The bark was rough against her back and she felt foolish hiding like a child playing games, but desperation had stripped away her pride. Other children began to arrive. The Murphy twins with their matching red hair and gap-toothed grins, young Sean O'Brien clutching his football under one arm, little Oif Byrne skipping along beside her older brother. They chattered and laughed, the easy confidence of children who belonged, who had never questioned their right to take up space in the world. Then came the familiar rumble of the diesel engine, and Odrin Killeen's green bus rounded the corner. Milena pressed herself closer to the tree, watching as the vehicle came to a stop with a hydraulic hiss. The door folded open, and Killeen stepped down with the practiced ease of 20 years' experience. And then she saw it with the clarity of winter sunlight cutting through fog. Killeen, all smiles and cheerful greetings for the Irish children, calling them love and pet and young scholar as they climbed aboard. His voice was warm as fresh bread, his manner grandfatherly and kind. He ruffled Sean's hair, complimented Awif on her new school shoes, asked the Murphy twins if they were ready for their football match that afternoon. But when Thea approached, small and hesitant in her Navy school uniform, her school bag clutched against her chest, his face changed completely. The warmth drained from his eyes like water from a broken cup. No smile, no greeting, no acknowledgement that she was anything more than an obstacle to be dealt with. Just a cold nod of his gray head, a gesture for her to board that was less invitation than command. The child kept her eyes down, climbing those steps as though entering a place where she knew pain waited. Her small shoulders hunched forward, making herself smaller, trying to disappear. Milena's heart broke clean in half watching her daughter transform from a little girl into something cowering and defeated. When she returned home, trembling like a leaf in an autumn gale, and told Dushan what she'd witnessed, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "Maybe he just doesn't care for foreigners. It's not uncommon here, Milena. We both know that." But even as he spoke the words, his voice lacked conviction. They both knew this was about more than mere prejudice, more than the casual dismissal they'd grown accustomed to. This was something darker, something targeted and deliberate. Milena didn't respond immediately. She went to make breakfast, cracking eggs with more force than necessary, the shells splitting under her fingers like tiny bones. But inside her chest, a certainty was growing like fire in a peat bog. Slow at first, then unstoppable. This wasn't merely dislike or prejudice. This was something that would destroy her child's spirit if she didn't act soon. And as she watched Dushan read the same newspaper paragraph 3 times without comprehension, she knew that the choice, and the responsibility, was hers alone to make. That week brought news that made Milena's stomach drop like a stone into dark water. The school secretary, Mrs. Nolan, rang with the crisp efficiency of someone delivering routine information. Mrs. Jovanovich, Miss O'Sullivan wanted me to let you know that Thea has been somewhat socially withdrawn lately. She's not participating in group activities and seems quite isolated during break time. The words stung more than they should have. Milena found herself gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles went white. Has she done something wrong? She asked, though she already knew the answer would miss the point entirely. Oh no, nothing like that. She's a lovely child, very well behaved. Perhaps too well behaved if you know what I mean. Miss O'Sullivan just thought you should be aware. After the call ended, Milena sat staring at the wall where they'd hung a small photograph of Thea's first day at St. Brigid's. In the picture, her daughter wore a bright smile and held her new school bag proudly. The contrast with the silent, withdrawn child who now came home each day was heartbreaking. That evening, when Thea was in the bath, Milena made a decision that felt like betrayal but necessity at the same time. She searched through her daughter's school bag with the methodical thoroughness of someone looking for evidence of a crime. Past the neatly organized books, the pencil case with its carefully sharpened colored pencils, the lunchbox that came home half full most days because Thea claimed she wasn't hungry. At the very bottom, crushed between the pages of a maths workbook like a pressed flower, she found it. A small piece of paper torn from an exercise book and folded so many times the creases had worn white. Milena's hands trembled as she unfolded it, revealing words written in Thea's careful, childish handwriting. Sorry for being me. The note was dated from 3 days ago, written in pencil that had been pressed so hard it had nearly torn through the paper. Below the words was a small drawing, a stick figure standing alone under what looked like rain clouds, with X's for eyes. Milena felt the room spin around her. She had to grip the edge of Thea's desk to keep from falling, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. This wasn't just about what happened on the bus anymore. This was about a 7-year-old child who had been made to feel that her very existence was something to apologize for. She didn't say anything that night. Instead, she sat by Thea's bedside longer than usual, stroking her daughter's hair and humming lullabies in Bosnian, songs her own mother had sung to her during the uncertain years of her childhood. But even as Thea slept, her small face was troubled, tiny frowns appearing and disappearing like ripples on water. Later, when Dushan was asleep and the house had settled into its nighttime creaks and sighs, Milena stood in the doorway of their daughter's room and cried silently, her shoulders shaking with the effort of keeping her grief quiet. The note felt like it was burning a hole in her pocket, a physical weight of her child's pain. The next morning, she made her second difficult decision. She would go to the school, speak to the head teacher, demand answers. She dressed carefully in her best outfit, a navy skirt and cream blouse she'd bought for job interviews, clothes that said respectable and deserving of attention. She even put on the small gold earrings that had been her mother's, hoping they might lend her some authority she didn't feel. St. Brigid's Primary sat on a hill overlooking the village, its red brick facade and neat playground surrounded by a low stone wall. Milena had walked past it countless times, but entering through the main doors still felt like crossing into foreign territory. The secretary, Mrs. Nolan, looked up from her computer with the polite smile reserved for parents who arrived without appointments. I need to speak with Mr. Brennan about my daughter, Thea Jovanovich, Milena said, trying to keep her voice steady. The head teacher's office smelled of instant coffee and floor polish. Mr. Brennan was a man in his 50s with thinning hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, but his manner was cautious as he gestured for Milena to sit. On his desk was a framed photograph of children in graduation gowns, and behind him hung certificates and awards that spoke of a life dedicated to education. Mrs. Jovanovich, how can I help you today? Milena took a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest. I'm concerned about Thea's well-being. She's become withdrawn, she's not eating properly, and I believe something is happening that's affecting her badly. Mr. Brennan's expression remained carefully neutral. Has Thea mentioned anything specific? Any incidents with other children, perhaps? It's not the children, it's... Milena hesitated, knowing that her next words would change everything. It's about Mr. Killeen, the bus driver. The change in the room's atmosphere was immediate and palpable. Mr. Brennan's posture stiffened slightly, and he began straightening papers on his desk that were already perfectly straight. Mrs. Jovanovich, Mr. Killeen has been driving for our school for 20 years without a single complaint. He's an exemplary employee and a respected member of our community. But Thea has been... Children often have difficulty adjusting, especially children from different backgrounds. Perhaps Thea is simply experiencing some cultural adaptation challenges. These things take time. The words hit Milena like a slap. Different backgrounds, cultural adaptation, code words for, your child doesn't belong here and neither do you. Sir, with respect, my daughter was born in Dublin. This is her country as much as anyone's. Mr. Brennan's smile was patronizing in the way that only institutional authority could manage. Of course. What I'm suggesting is that perhaps we're looking at this from the wrong angle. Children Thea's age often create stories to explain feelings they can't understand. It's quite normal. Milena felt her carefully prepared arguments crumbling. She wanted to show him the note, to demand he take her seriously, but something in his manner told her it would be dismissed as easily as everything else she'd said. I see, she said quietly, standing to leave. Thank you for your time. As she walked toward the door, Mr. Brennan called after her, Mrs. Jovanovic, I do hope you'll consider how serious accusations can affect not just individuals, but entire communities. Sometimes it's better to let children work through their difficulties naturally. Milena left the school feeling smaller than when she'd arrived, but also clearer about one thing. They were truly on their own. In the car park, she encountered an elderly woman loading shopping bags into a battered Volkswagen. The woman looked up as Milena passed, and their eyes met for a moment. Something in that gaze made Milena stop. Excuse me, the woman said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. You're Thea's mother, aren't you? Milena nodded, suddenly wary. I'm Noreen Kevin. I've lived in this village for 73 years. She paused, studying Milena's face. You're not the first mother to come out of that building looking like that. And you won't be the first to discover that some truths are too expensive for small places to afford. Before Milena could respond, Mrs. Cavan had climbed into her car and driven away, leaving her standing alone in the car park with more questions than answers, and the growing certainty that Thea's pain was just one thread in a much larger, much darker tapestry. The encounter with Mrs. Cavan had planted a seed that grew through the night like ivy on stone walls. If other mothers had stood in that car park with the same defeated expression, if other children had suffered in the same silence, then perhaps Milena wasn't as alone as she'd believed. But finding those voices would require courage she wasn't sure she possessed. The next morning brought a decision that felt both desperate and inevitable. She would knock on doors, speak to neighbors, search for the truth that everyone seemed determined to bury. The thought terrified her. Immigrants didn't make waves, didn't ask uncomfortable questions, didn't challenge the established order. But watching Thea pick at her porridge with the mechanical movements of someone who'd forgotten how to feel hungry made the choice clear. Her first stop was Maeve Driscoll's cottage at the end of their street. Mrs. Driscoll was known throughout Kilkerran as the unofficial keeper of village information. The sort of woman who knew which marriages were struggling, which businesses were failing, and which teenagers were seen where they shouldn't be. Her front garden was a riot of color even in the gray April weather, with daffodils and early tulips arranged in neat borders that spoke of obsessive care. Milena knocked softly, her heart hammering against her ribs. When the door opened, Mrs. Driscoll's expression shifted from polite curiosity to wariness in the space of a heartbeat. Mrs. Jovanovic, how can I help you? I'm sorry to bother you, Mrs. Driscoll, but I wondered if we might have a word about the school bus and Mr. Colleen. The change was immediate and unmistakable. Mrs. Driscoll's face hardened, her grip tightening on the door handle. Mr. Colleen is a decent man who's served this community faithfully for 20 years. I'd suggest you be very careful about making insinuations that could damage a good man's reputation. I'm not trying to damage anyone. I'm trying to protect my daughter. Your daughter is a lucky child to be receiving a good Irish education. Perhaps instead of looking for problems, you should be showing gratitude for the opportunities you've been given here. The door closed with finality that echoed down the empty street. Milena stood on the step for a moment, feeling the weight of invisible eyes watching from behind net curtains. She could sense the village closing ranks, protective walls rising around one of their own. Across the road, she noticed movement at an upstairs window. A curtain quickly drawn shut, then another and another, until it seemed every house on the street had suddenly developed an interest in privacy. The message was clear. Whatever was happening to her daughter, whatever truth she was seeking, it was not welcome here. When she returned home, Dushan was attempting to prepare lunch, his movements clumsy with frustration. Pots clanged against the cooker, and she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was set in the stubborn line that meant he was fighting some internal battle. How did it go? he asked without looking at her. About as well as you'd expect. They ate in silence, the weight of unspoken thoughts filling the small kitchen like smoke. When Thea arrived home from school, Milena immediately noticed the state of her uniform. The white blouse was stained with what looked like chocolate milk, and there were grass stains on the knees of her tights. "What happened to your clothes, love?" Thea shrugged, not meeting her mother's eyes. "Nothing, just fell down." But as she headed toward her room, she paused by the kitchen door. Without turning around, she said in a voice so quiet Milena had to strain to hear it, "He said I deserved to get my lunch spilled on me. Said foreign children should learn to be more careful." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that couldn't be extinguished. Dushan's fork clattered against his plate, and Milena felt something inside her chest crack clean in half. "Thea, love, come here." But their daughter had already disappeared into her room, leaving them staring at each other across the debris of their carefully controlled world. That evening, while Thea slept fitfully upstairs, Milena found herself going through her daughter's schoolwork with forensic attention. Hidden between the pages of her English workbook, she discovered another drawing. This one showed a small figure standing alone at a bus stop, surrounded by dark shapes that could have been birds or storm clouds. Written in careful letters at the bottom were the words, "Today I managed not to cry." Almost. The drawing felt like a physical blow. Milena sank onto Thea's bed, clutching the paper with trembling hands. This wasn't just about isolated incidents anymore. This was systematic, deliberate, designed to break a child's spirit so slowly that by the time anyone noticed, it would be too late to repair the damage. She made her decision in that moment, sitting in her daughter's small bedroom surrounded by the remnants of a childhood that was being stolen piece by piece. Tomorrow, she would follow the bus route in their car. She would document everything, gather evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. The next morning, after walking Thea to the bus stop with her usual kiss and encouragement, Milena drove to a position where she could observe without being seen. She parked behind a cluster of hawthorn trees about 100 meters from the first stop and waited. The bus appeared on schedule, its familiar green bulk rumbling down the narrow road. Milena watched through binoculars Dushan had bought for birdwatching, a hobby he'd never taken up but that now served a darker purpose. She could see Colleen clearly through the driver's window, his profile sharp against the morning light. At the first stop, 3 children waited, the Byrne siblings and young Tommy Walsh. Colleen greeted them with obvious warmth, his smile genuine as they climbed aboard. She could even hear fragments of his cheerful voice carried on the morning air. The second stop brought more of the same. Local children received with patience and kindness, their chatter encouraged, their small dramas given attention and sympathy. But at the third stop, where Thea waited alone by the stone wall of Flanagan's farm, everything changed. Milena watched through the binoculars as Colleen's expression hardened, his welcoming demeanor vanishing like mist before the sun. He opened the door with obvious reluctance, and when Thea approached, he said something that made her hesitate on the bottom step. Milena couldn't hear the words, but she could see their effect. Her daughter's small shoulders hunched as though she'd been struck, and she climbed aboard with the careful movements of someone expecting punishment. When the bus pulled away, Milena followed at a distance, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they ached. At the school gates, she watched Thea descend from the bus last after all the other children had already run toward the playground. The child walked slowly, her head down, carrying herself like someone who'd learned to expect disappointment. That evening, Milena didn't sleep on the sofa. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table with a notebook, writing down everything she'd observed, every detail that might matter. The clock on the wall marked the passing hours, but she barely noticed. For the first time since this nightmare began, she felt like she was doing something concrete, something that might actually help her daughter. When Dushan found her there at dawn, surrounded by pages of careful observations, he looked at her with something she hadn't seen in weeks. "Hope, what's all this?" "Evidence," she said simply. "Tomorrow, I'm going to make sure someone listens to what we have to say." Outside, the Irish dawn was breaking gray and cold, but for the first time since Thea had spoken those terrible words, Milena felt like she could see clearly through the darkness. Friday arrived with the weight of dread that had become familiar in the Jovanovic household. It was the one day of the week when Milena couldn't collect Thea from school. Dushan had secured extra maintenance work at the new housing development outside Galway. Over time, they desperately needed to cover the mounting bills that seemed to multiply like weeds in their small kitchen drawer. They'd argued about it the night before. Voices kept deliberately low so Thea wouldn't hear from her bedroom above. Milena had paced their tiny sitting room like a caged animal, her hands twisting the tea towel she'd been holding until it was wrung into a tight rope. I don't want her on that bus alone. Not after everything we've seen. Dushan had looked up from the job sheet he'd been studying, his eyes rimmed with the exhaustion of a man carrying too many worries. Milena, we need this work. The Murphys are already whispering that I'm unreliable because I've been leaving early to collect Thea. If I lose this job, he'd let the sentence hang between them, heavy with implications they both understood. So we sacrifice our daughter for a few extra euros. We protect our daughter by keeping a roof over her head and food on the table. He knows we're watching now. Surely he won't try anything. The compromise they'd reached felt like defeat wrapped in necessity. Just this once. Just one Friday. What could happen in the space of a 20-minute bus journey? By 4 o'clock that afternoon, Milena had positioned herself at the kitchen window, her eyes fixed on the bend in the road where the bus always appeared first. The kettle had boiled 3 times while she waited, forgotten each time as her attention focused entirely on that empty stretch of tarmac. 4:10 p.m. Nothing but the neighbor's cat picking its way delicately across the wet grass. 4:15 p.m. A delivery van rumbled past, but no familiar green bus followed in its wake. 4:20 p.m. The silence began to feel ominous, pressing against the windows like floodwater. Milena's hands started to shake as she reached for the phone. The school secretary's voice was crisp and efficient, tinged with the subtle impatience reserved for anxious parents. St. Brigid's Primary, Mrs. Nolan speaking. This is Milena Jovanovic. My daughter Thea should have been home by now on the bus. Has there been a delay? Let me check for you. The sound of computer keys clicking, then a pause that stretched too long. According to our records, all children were dismissed on schedule and boarded their respective buses. Mr. Kileen's route departed at 3:45 p.m. as usual. The words hit Milena like ice water. But she's not home. She's never this late. Perhaps there was traffic or an unscheduled stop. I'm sure she'll turn up shortly. The casual dismissal in the woman's voice made Milena's stomach clench. She hung up and immediately dialed Dushan's mobile, her fingers fumbling with the numbers in her haste. Milena, what's wrong? Thea's not home. The bus left on time, but she's not here. The sound of tools clattering came through the phone, followed by Dushan's voice, sharp with panic. I'm leaving now. Call the guards. But Milena was already reaching for the landline again, her other hand pressed against the window as she scanned the empty road. The same emergency operator who'd taken her first call about Kileen answered, her voice professionally neutral. Emergency services, how can I help you? My daughter is missing. She's 7 years old. She was supposed to be on the school bus, but she never came home. How long has she been missing, ma'am? Milena glanced at the clock, each tick seeming to echo in her chest. 40 minutes. I know that might not seem long, but something's wrong. She's never late, never deviates from her routine. Can you describe your daughter for me? As Milena provided the details. Dark hair in a ponytail, navy school uniform, small for her age. She felt a part of herself fragmenting. This was every parent's nightmare, the scenario that haunted quiet moments and sleepless nights. But knowing it could happen and living it were entirely different experiences. The operator's questions continued with practiced efficiency. Had Thea ever run away before? Was there anywhere she might have gone? Any family disputes or recent changes that might have upset her? You don't understand, Milena found herself saying, her voice rising despite her efforts to stay calm. There's been an ongoing situation with the bus driver. I've reported it before. My daughter has been targeted and now she's missing. The slight pause before the operator's response told Milena everything she needed to know about how seriously her concerns were being taken. We'll dispatch an officer to take a full report, ma'am. In the meantime, please try to remain calm. Remain calm, as if panic were a choice she could simply decide against. Dushan arrived 20 minutes later, his face gray with fear and his work clothes still dusty from the construction site. Without saying a word, he grabbed their car keys and headed for the door. Where are you going? To drive the bus route. Every stop, every turn. If she's out there somewhere. Milena watched him go, then turned back to her vigil at the window. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the village. Somewhere out there, her 7-year-old daughter was alone, and every passing minute felt like a small death. At 4:43 p.m., just as Milena was preparing to call the guards again, she heard it, the distinctive creak of their front gate. She spun toward the window and saw a small figure stumbling up their garden path, moving with the unsteady gait of someone pushed beyond endurance. Thea. Milena flew to the door, yanking it open with such force it banged against the wall. Her daughter stood on the threshold, covered in mud and grass stains, her school uniform torn and her shoes squelching with water. But it was her eyes that stopped Milena's heart. Vacant, staring, like she was seeing something no one else could see. "Thea, oh God, where have you been?" She swept the child into her arms, feeling the solid reality of her daughter's body against her chest. Thea submitted to the embrace passively, like a rag doll, offering no resistance but no response either. Dushan's car pulled up just as Milena was carrying Thea into the house. He took one look at his daughter's condition and dropped to his knees beside the sofa where Milena had settled her. "What happened, little star? Where were you?" For long moments, Thea said nothing. She stared at the wall above their heads, her breathing shallow and rapid. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat, emotionless, as though she were reciting something she'd memorized. "He told me to get off at the wrong stop. Said it was so I could learn my place. Said foreign children need to understand they don't belong everywhere they think they do." The words fell into the room like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through both parents. Milena felt her vision blur with rage so pure it was almost blinding. "Where, Thea? Where did he make you get off?" "By the old quarry road, the one with no houses. He drove away and left me there." Dushan's face went white. The old quarry road was nearly 3 miles from their house, along a route with no footpath and heavy traffic from lorries serving the industrial estate. For a 7-year-old to walk that distance alone, in school shoes not designed for rough terrain, was not just cruel. It was dangerous beyond measure. "How did you find your way home?" "I followed the signs. And when I got scared, I hid behind trees until the big trucks passed." Milena closed her eyes, trying not to picture her daughter crouched in ditches, terrified and alone while traffic thundered past. When she opened them again, her decision was crystal clear. "This ends now," she said, reaching for the phone. "I don't care who believes us and who doesn't. I don't care what it costs us. This man has put our child in danger and someone is going to answer for it." As she dialed 112 for the 3rd time in as many weeks, Milena felt something fundamental shift inside her. The immigrant woman who'd spent months trying to make herself invisible, who'd accepted casual dismissals and veiled prejudices in the name of keeping peace, was gone. In her place stood a mother who would burn down the entire village if necessary to protect her child. The operator who answered was different this time, younger sounding, and when she heard Milena's voice there was immediate recognition. "Mrs. Jovanovic, we've been expecting your call. There's an officer en route to you now." This time the guards arrived within the hour. Not the usual patrol car with its casual authority, but an unmarked vehicle that spoke of serious intent. 2 officers emerged. Inspector Eamon Callahan, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s whose weathered face suggested decades of dealing with village politics and uncomfortable truths, and Sergeant Fiona O'Dubgail, younger by 20 years but carrying herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd earned her position through competence rather than connections. Milena watched from the window as they approached, noting how Inspector Callahan's eyes swept the street, cataloging which neighbors might be watching, which curtains had twitched at their arrival. This was a man who understood the delicate ecosystem of small-town dynamics, who knew that every action would be dissected and discussed in Murphy's pub before the evening was out. "Mrs. Jovanovic, I'm Inspector Callahan. This is Sergeant O'Dubgail. We understand you've had some concerns about your daughter's safety." There was something in his tone that immediately put Milena on edge. The careful neutrality of someone who'd already formed opinions, but was going through the motions of investigation. She led them into the sitting room where Thea sat curled in the corner of the sofa, still wearing her mud-stained uniform, her small hands wrapped around a mug of hot chocolate that had long since gone cold, while Inspector Callahan settled into the armchair with the deliberate movements of a man taking control of a situation. Sergeant O'Dubgail did something unexpected. She walked directly to Thea, crouched down until she was at eye level with the child, but didn't speak immediately. Instead, she simply sat there on the floor, patient as stone, letting the silence stretch until it became comfortable rather than oppressive. "That's a lovely drawing on your school bag," she said eventually, her voice carrying the soft lilt of someone raised speaking Irish at home. "Did you do that yourself?" Thea nodded, the first genuine response she'd given since arriving home. "I used to draw when I was your age. Mostly horses, though I'd never seen one except in pictures." Fiona's smile was genuine, reaching her eyes in a way that spoke of someone who remembered what it felt like to be small and powerless. "Would you like to show me some of your other drawings while the adults talk?" In the kitchen, Inspector Callahan had already begun his interrogation, though he called it an interview. His notebook lay open on the table, but Milena noticed he spent more time studying her face than writing down her answers. Now then, Mrs. Jovanovic, I understand you've made some serious allegations against Ordan Kilin. These are weighty accusations against a man who served this community faithfully for 2 decades, without so much as a parking ticket to his name. The words hit Milena like a slap. Before she could respond, he continued, his voice taking on the patronizing tone she'd come to recognize and despise. You have to understand the gravity of what you're suggesting. Ordan is not just an employee. He's woven into the fabric of this place. He coached the under-12 football team for 15 years. He delivers meals to the elderly during harsh winters. He's been a pallbearer at more funerals than I can count. And what exactly does that have to do with how he treats my daughter? Milena's voice was sharper than she'd intended, but she was past caring about diplomatic niceties. Dushan, who'd been silent until now, spoke up from his position by the window. Inspector, our daughter was abandoned 3 miles from home today. She's 7 years old. She could have been killed walking along that road. Callahan's pen paused over his notebook. Mr. Jovanovic, I appreciate your concern, but children sometimes misunderstand instructions. Perhaps there was confusion about which stop. There was no confusion. The voice came from the sitting room doorway where Sergeant Odubkhail stood with Thea's small hand clasped in hers. I've been listening to what this young lady has to tell me, and her account is remarkably consistent and detailed. The look that passed between the 2 officers was electric with unspoken tension. Clearly, this was not how Inspector Callahan had expected the interview to proceed. Sergeant, perhaps we should discuss. With respect, sir, I think we should hear what the child has to say. In her own words, Fiona guided Thea to a chair at the kitchen table, positioning herself between the child and Inspector Callahan in a way that was both protective and professionally assertive. Thea, can you tell us about what happened on the bus today? What followed was 15 minutes of testimony that chilled the room to its core. Thea spoke in a quiet, matter-of-fact voice that was somehow more devastating than tears would have been. She described months of systematic humiliation, being forced to sit at the back of the bus while other children were allowed to choose their seats, having her lunch deliberately knocked to the floor, being called names in Irish that she didn't understand, but that made the other children laugh and turn away from her. He told me today that foreign children need to learn they can't go everywhere they think they belong, she said, her voice never wavering. He said if I told anyone, he'd make sure I learned that lesson properly next time. Inspector Callahan's face had grown progressively more uncomfortable during the recitation. Now, Thea, these are very serious things you're saying. Are you quite sure you understood correctly? Sometimes adults say things that children might misinterpret. I understood perfectly. The voice was Fiona's, not Thea's, and it carried an authority that made everyone in the room look up sharply. Because 30 years ago, I was sitting in a similar kitchen, telling similar adults about similar experiences, and I was dismissed in remarkably similar language. The silence that followed was profound. Inspector Callahan's pen had stopped moving entirely, and Milena could see something shifting behind his eyes. Calculation, perhaps, or the dawning realization that this case might not be as easily buried as he'd assumed. Sergeant, I think perhaps we should discuss the appropriate next steps outside, but Fiona was already standing, her hand still resting protectively on Thea's shoulder. The appropriate next step, Inspector, is a formal investigation. I'll be conducting interviews with other parents, reviewing any complaints that might have been filed and dismissed, and examining the employment records of everyone involved in the school transport system. That seems rather extensive for what might be a misunderstanding. Child endangerment is never a misunderstanding, sir, and abandoning a 7-year-old 3 miles from home certainly qualifies as endangerment in my book. After the officers left, Callahan with obvious reluctance, Fiona with a promise to return the following day, the Jovanovic family sat in their kitchen, feeling the weight of something that had fundamentally changed. The protective silence that had surrounded Ordan Kilin for 20 years had developed its first crack, and through that crack, light was beginning to seep in. That evening, as Milena tucked Thea into bed, her daughter looked up at her with eyes that seemed older than they had that morning. "Ma'am, is the lady policeman going to make him stop?" Milena smoothed the dark hair back from her daughter's forehead, choosing her words carefully. "She's going to try very hard, love. And for the first time, I think we have someone who's really listening." "Good," Thea said, closing her eyes. "I'm tired of being afraid." As Milena turned off the bedroom light, she reflected on Sergeant Odubgail's parting words. Sometimes it takes an outsider to see what a community has trained itself not to notice, but once it's seen, it can't be unseen. Outside, the village of Kilkerran settled into its evening routines, unaware that the foundations of its carefully maintained peace were beginning to shift. In houses throughout the area, other parents were looking at their children with new eyes, asking questions they'd never thought to ask before. And in a small cottage with roses climbing the walls, a man who'd never faced consequences for his actions was discovering that some things, once spoken aloud, could never be taken back. Sergeant Odubgile's investigation began at dawn the following Monday. But it was Milena who struck the first real blow against the wall of silence that had protected Ordan Kilin for 2 decades. Over the weekend, she'd made a decision that terrified and liberated her in equal measure. She would tell their story publicly. Consequences be damned. The Kilkerran Community Facebook page had always been a carefully curated space where residents shared photos of village fates, complained about potholes, and celebrated local achievements. It was moderated by Father McKenna and 3 prominent local women, all of whom had lived in the village for their entire lives and understood the unwritten rules about what could and couldn't be discussed in public forums. Milena's post appeared at 6 a.m. on Monday morning, before the moderators had finished their breakfast tea. She'd written it in her careful English, each word chosen with the precision of someone who knew she would get only one chance to be heard. My name is Milena Jovanovic, and I live on Seaview Lane with my husband Dushan and our 7-year-old daughter Thea. We moved to Kilkerran 2 years ago, hoping to build a peaceful life in what seemed like a welcoming community. I am writing this because I can no longer stay silent about what has been happening to my child. For months, our daughter has been systematically targeted and humiliated by the person entrusted with her safe passage to and from school. She has been made to feel that her very existence is somehow wrong, that being born to immigrant parents makes her less deserving of basic human dignity. Last Friday, she was deliberately abandoned 3 miles from home and forced to walk along dangerous roads because, in the words of her tormentor, foreign children need to learn their place. I am not writing this to destroy anyone's reputation. I am writing this because somewhere in our village there might be another parent who has watched their child come home with inexplicable bruises, unexplained tears, or that particular kind of silence that comes when a child has learned that no one will listen to their pain. If your son or daughter has ever returned from the school bus looking like something inside them had been broken, please know that they are not alone. If you have ever wondered why your child suddenly started having nightmares or became afraid of something they couldn't name, perhaps we should talk. I am not asking you to take my word for anything. I am simply asking you to look at your own children with new eyes and ask yourself if their silence might be protecting someone who doesn't deserve protection. My daughter deserves better than this. All our children deserve better than this. By 7 a.m., the post had been shared 12 times. By 8 a.m., the comment section was exploding with responses that split the village down lines that had been invisible until now. The first wave of comments came from the expected quarters, longtime residents who felt personally attacked by the suggestion that their community might harbor someone capable of such cruelty. Mrs. Connolly wrote, "This is absolutely disgraceful. Ordan Kilin is a saint who has dedicated his life to our children. These foreign families come here expecting special treatment and then make wild accusations when they don't get it." But then other voices began to emerge, tentative at first, then growing bolder as they realized they weren't alone. Sarah Murphy, "I've always wondered why my Jamie stopped wanting to sit at the front of the bus. He used to love talking to Mr. Kilin, but something changed last year." An anonymous comment, "My daughter is half Polish. She's been coming home with torn homework for months, saying it fell out of her bag. Maybe it didn't fall." Margaret O'Brien, "I don't want to cause trouble, but my grandson Shion mentioned that Mr. Kilin has different rules for different children. I thought it was just child's imagination." By lunchtime, the post had been shared across 3 counties, and the Kilkerran community page had become a battlefield of competing narratives. Father McKenna posted a carefully worded statement calling for Christian charity and careful consideration before making judgments, but the momentum had already shifted beyond the control of traditional village authority. At 2 p.m., Milena received a phone call that changed everything. "Mrs. Jovanovic, this is Helen Byrne. My daughter Roisin was in the same class as your Thea last year, before we moved her to St. Joseph's in Galway. I've been following the discussion online and I think we need to talk." They met at the small cafe beside the church, a neutral space where they could speak without drawing the attention that a home visit would inevitably attract. Helen Byrne was a woman in her 40s with prematurely gray hair and the carefully controlled manner of someone who had learned to navigate dangerous waters. She ordered 2 cups of tea and waited until they were alone before speaking. Roisin never rode the school bus, she said without preamble. We told people it was because I worked part-time and could drive her, but that wasn't the truth. The truth was that after 3 weeks of riding with Mr. Killeen, my 6-year-old daughter started wetting herself every morning before school. Milena felt her heart clench with recognition. She couldn't tell me what was wrong, just that the bus made her feel bad inside. One morning I followed the bus route and saw him make her sit on the floor at the back while the other children got proper seats. When I confronted the school, they said there must have been a misunderstanding. Why didn't you push it? Helen's laugh was bitter. Because my husband works for the county council, and his supervisor is Mr. Killeen's brother-in-law. Because we couldn't afford private school and couldn't move away. Because sometimes keeping your head down seems like the only way to protect your family. That evening, armed with Helen's corroboration and a growing sense that the truth couldn't be contained much longer, Milena made her way to the emergency parish meeting that had been hastily organized in response to the day's online controversy. The church hall was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the car park. Father McKenna attempted to maintain order, but the carefully structured agenda he'd prepared was swept away by the raw emotion that filled the room. Accusations flew across the space like arrows. Neighbors who'd known each other for decades, suddenly seeing each other as enemies or allies in a war they hadn't known was being fought. Milena found herself in the center of a storm she'd created but could no longer control. She stood at the back of the hall, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes upon her, some filled with sympathy, others with undisguised hostility. Then a voice cut through the chaos, elderly, wavering, but carrying the authority that comes from 7 decades of village life. Enough. Mrs. Noreen Kavan, the woman who'd spoken to Milena in the school car park, was standing slowly, her arthritic hands gripping the back of a wooden chair. I'm 83 years old and I've kept my mouth shut about things that needed saying for far too long. The hall fell silent with the respect automatically accorded to age and longevity. I've watched that man treat children differently based on where their parents were born, and I've said nothing because it was easier to pretend I didn't see it. I've watched him single out the vulnerable ones, the ones whose families wouldn't be believed if they complained, and I've told myself it wasn't my business. Her voice grew stronger as she continued, carrying across the packed room with startling clarity. But I won't die with that on my conscience, not when there's a young mother brave enough to risk everything to protect her child, and the rest of us haven't had the courage to support her. The hall erupted again, but the tenor of the conversation had shifted. Other voices began to emerge from the crowd, parents admitting to concerns they'd dismissed, grandparents recalling incidents they'd chosen to forget, teachers speaking carefully about observations they'd been discouraged from reporting. At the back of the room, Sergeant Odubukail stood observing, taking notes with the methodical precision of someone building a case. When the meeting finally ended near midnight, she approached Milena with an expression that mixed professional satisfaction with personal vindication. Mrs. Jovanovic, I think you'll be interested to know that I've received 17 formal complaints since this morning, and I suspect there will be more before the week is out. As they walked out into the cool night air, Milena felt something she hadn't experienced since arriving in Ireland 2 years earlier, the sensation of belonging to a community, even one fractured by conflict and uncomfortable truths. The village of Kilkerran would never be the same, but perhaps that was exactly what it needed. Sometimes the only way to heal a wound is to expose it to the light, no matter how much the process might hurt. The end, when it came, was both anticlimactic and profound. Ordon Killeen submitted his resignation on a gray Tuesday morning in May, citing health concerns and a desire to spend more time with family. The official statement from the school board made no mention of the investigation that had consumed Sergeant Odubukail's attention for 3 weeks, no acknowledgement of the 17 formal complaints that had materialized once parents realized their voices might actually be heard. Within a week, his cottage with the climbing roses stood empty, a for sale sign planted in the garden where prize-winning dahlias had once bloomed. The village grapevine, usually so reliable about tracking the movements of its residents, fell mysteriously silent about where he'd gone. Some said he'd moved to Cork to live with a sister. Others claimed he'd emigrated to England. The truth was that most people simply preferred not to know. The official response from the educational authorities was a masterpiece of bureaucratic non-commitment. An internal review had been conducted, policies had been examined, and additional training would be provided to all transport staff about cultural sensitivity and appropriate professional boundaries. No wrongdoing was formally acknowledged, no apologies were issued, and no compensation was offered to the families whose children had suffered in silence. But Milena had long since stopped expecting official vindication. The real victory lay in smaller, more personal changes that rippled through the community like stones thrown into still water. Mrs. Flanagan, who lived 3 doors down, began stopping Milena at the post office to ask how Thea was settling in at her new school in Galway, the private academy where she'd been offered a scholarship by an anonymous benefactor who turned out to be Father McKenna's cousin, a successful businessman in Dublin who'd been horrified by the events in his hometown. The elderly gentleman who ran the village shop started setting aside the best apples for Thea, claiming they were going off anyway and would only be wasted if someone didn't take them home. His wife began teaching Thea traditional Irish songs on Saturday afternoons, sessions that gradually expanded to include other children whose parents had previously kept them at careful distances from the foreign family. Most surprisingly, the Murphys, whose twin boys had been among the children who'd witnessed Thea's humiliation but said nothing, invited the Jovanovic family for Sunday dinner, an occasion that began awkwardly but ended with Thea and the twins building elaborate fairy houses in the back garden, while the adults shared stories about their respective childhoods in different countries. But the most profound change was in Thea herself. The silent, withdrawn child who'd crept through their house like a ghost began to emerge from her protective shell with cautious but genuine curiosity about the world around her. Her drawings, which had been filled with dark shapes and solitary figures, started featuring groups of children playing together, houses with welcoming doors and landscapes filled with flowers and sunshine. One evening in late June, as golden light slanted through their kitchen windows, Milena found her daughter at the table working on a new picture. This one showed a winding road leading from a school to a small house, but instead of the threatening buses and empty pathways that had dominated her earlier work, this drawing featured a bright yellow car with 2 figures inside, a mother and daughter traveling safely together. At the top of the page, in her careful handwriting, Thea had written, "I came home by the sea road. Now I know the way." Milena studied the drawing with the intensity of an art critic examining a masterpiece, understanding that she was looking at something far more significant than a child's afternoon project. This was a map of recovery, a visual representation of how her daughter had navigated from fear to safety, from isolation to belonging. "What's the sea road, love?" she asked, settling into the chair beside her daughter. "It's the long way home," Thea explained matter-of-factly. "The way I walked that day when he left me at the wrong place. I was scared then because I didn't know where I was going. But now I've been there and I know I can find my way back from anywhere." The simple wisdom of that statement took Milena's breath away. Her daughter had transformed the most traumatic experience of her young life into a source of strength and confidence. The abandoned child who'd stumbled home through dangerous traffic had become a young girl who knew she could navigate any road, no matter how unfamiliar or frightening it might initially appear. That night, after Thea had gone to bed, Milena and Dushan sat in their small garden, watching the last light fade over the Irish countryside. For the first time in months, the silence between them was comfortable rather than tense, filled with possibility rather than dread. "Do you think we did the right thing?" Dushan asked, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd carried too much worry for too long. Milena considered the question seriously. Their lives had been turned upside down, their place in the community forever altered, their daughter forced to confront cruelties that no child should have to understand. Yet somehow, impossibly, they'd all emerged stronger from the experience. "I think we did the only thing we could do," she said finally. "We protected our child and taught her that her voice matters, that she deserves to be heard and believed and safe. And the cost?" Milena looked back at their small house where a light still glowed in Thea's bedroom window. Not because she was afraid of the dark anymore, but because she was reading, lost in stories about brave children and magical adventures. What cost could be higher than losing her trust? What price could be greater than teaching her that injustice should be accepted in silence? 3 months later, Sergeant Odub Gael received a promotion to the divisional headquarters in Galway, recognition for her handling of what had become known in official circles as the Kilkerran incident. Before leaving, she stopped by the Jovanovic house for tea and to deliver news that surprised no one who'd been paying attention. "I wanted you to know that we've had inquiries from 3 other counties about similar situations. Apparently, once people realize they can speak up about these things, they tend to find their voices quite quickly. She paused at the door, studying Thea, who was teaching her dolls to play a clapping game she'd learned from the Murphy twins. "You know, Mrs. Jovanovic, I've been thinking about that first day when I met your daughter. She reminded me of myself at that age, convinced that being different meant being wrong, that safety lay in making yourself invisible. But look at her now." They both watched as Thea abandoned her dolls to chase a butterfly around the garden, her laughter carrying across the afternoon air like music. "Sometimes the greatest gift we can give a child is the knowledge that they're worth fighting for," Fiona continued, "not just by their parents, but by their community, by their society, by the institutions that are supposed to protect them." As summer gave way to autumn, the story of what had happened in Kilkerran began to spread beyond the borders of County Galway. Journalists wrote think pieces about immigrant integration and institutional accountability. Academic researchers cited it as a case study in community response to systematic discrimination. Policymakers used it as justification for new training programs and oversight mechanisms. But for the Jovanovic family, the most important change was simpler and more profound than any of those official responses. They had learned that home isn't just a place where you're safe. It's a place where you're seen, heard, and valued for exactly who you are. And on quiet evenings when the three of them sat together in their small sitting room, Thea would sometimes show them new drawings, pictures of a village where children of all backgrounds played together, where adults listened when someone needed help, where the roads all led safely home. In those drawings, the sun was always shining, and no one was ever left to walk alone. How many times has silence spoken louder than truth? And what would you do if it were your child? Your grandchild? What would you do if no one believed the pain of someone you love most? Today, you heard the story of a mother who didn't shout because she wanted to. She shouted because no one else was listening. And even surrounded by closed doors, she chose to keep them open, so her daughter would never feel alone again. The most painful thing about this story is realizing that real monsters don't live in films. They hide behind smiles, positions, and routines. And often, it's easier to protect reputations than to protect a child, but it was the courage of a mother, the innocence of a little girl, and the attentive gaze of a policewoman that opened a crack in the wall of omission. And perhaps that crack is exactly where the light begins to enter.